Midweek Murders contains graphic and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised.
It's Wednesday, which means that it's time to talk about crime. You're listening to Midweek Murders, and I'm your host, Sandra.
G'day, mates. I'm your best Australian buddy, Joey.
That's Joe, and he's English.
I'm totally English. Definitely not from the Gold Coast in Australia.
Okay, so this week we're going to talk about the murders of Ann and Thomas Farrow, and I got my information from Wikipedia about forensics. Article in Mental Floss by Jennifer M. Wood. Article in London News Online by News Reporter. No, I'm just kidding. It was just by News Reporter. That poor employee's name didn't come up in the, but I think it was an excerpt from like a book or something. Never mind. What's your sources?
My source is a history.com, the wikipedia.org page on the Stratton Brothers, Forensic Science Simplified, and Crime Scene to Court, The Essentials of Forensic Science, edited by Peter White, ISBN 978-1-84755-882-4.
Are you going to be Australian this whole episode?
I'm a special guest.
Special guest, Manic Joe. This is going to be so confusing for the listeners. Also, you did your whole sources section in Australian. We're going to be fucked. Everyone who doesn't listen to the podcast.
Anyone who doesn't listen to the podcast won't have an issue because they're not listening to the podcast.
That's fucking true. Is it technically correct?
The best kind of correct.
Mm-hmm. So on the 27th of March, 1905, a Monday, yes, I Googled what was the 27th of March, 1905. Turns out it's a Monday. You're welcome. 16-year-old William Jones arrived at his place of work at the Chapman's Oil and Colour shop in southeast London at 8:30 a.m. He tried opening the door but found that it was locked, which was very unusual as the shop opened at 8 o'clock. The shop manager was a 71-year-old man named Thomas Farrow, who lived with his 65-year-old wife Anne in a flat above the shop. William knocked on the door, thinking Thomas or Anne would hear this, but nobody answered. He looked into the windows and saw that some chairs were knocked over. Suspicious,
I'll say.
Confused and alarmed, William went to another one of Chapman's stores and fetched Lewis Kidman, who accompanied him back to the store, and together they forced themselves in through the back door. When they got
Cheeky.
inside... What?
Cheeky.
Oh, you're talking about anal. But still. When they got inside, they discovered Thomas' lifeless body clad in his pajamas in the parlor, lying in a pool of blood. William and Lewis called the police, and after arriving at the scene, they found Anne unconscious and badly beaten in the couple's bed in the upstairs flat. The police noticed that there was no sign of forced entry, which must have meant that Thomas opened the door, probably thinking that it was early customers. The shop was a mess, and the box where the store's money was kept in was empty. As a robbery.
See.
Claro. William informed the police that Thomas would take the shop's weekly profit to the bank on Mondays, which is why I Googled if it was a Monday, and it was. which meant that the people who murdered him had gotten away with a whole week's worth of earnings. It was estimated to have been 13 pounds, which maybe doesn't sound like much, but today, I googled this as well, that would be 1,592 pounds.
Oh, I googled that.
I was like, 13 pounds? How much would that be? But also, if a flat in my area in the 90s would go for 80 to 90,000 pounds, and today is like 500 to 800 pounds, I was like, oh my god, that's inflation from the 90s.
500 to 800 pounds. That is good deflation.
Oh, what?
You forgot to say 1,000.
Oh, 1,000. Yeah.
If your flats in London are going for 500 to 800 pounds, sign me up.
I'm gonna be a millionaire.
No, you'd be 100-aire.
Oh shit, I forgot the zeros again. Oh no. Sergeant Albert Atkinson made sure the doctor was called to take Ann Farrow to the hospital and pushed the money box to the side with his bare hands to clear the way of the door. And this was in most of the articles I read, but also it sounds like it actually wasn't that relevant because I couldn't find why that was relevant.
As in why he did it, or why it's documented?
Why it's documented, because I thought that meant that his fingerprints were on the box, but that didn't come up.
So I think the reason it's documented is that this case relies entirely upon the fingerprints on the cash box, and the investigating officer picked it up and moved it aside with bare hands.
Yeah.
Straight from the start of the crime scene, you've got the possibility of your key piece of evidence being destroyed.
Tampered with.
Because Albert ain't got a fucking clue what he's doing.
So the case was then handed over to Chief Inspector Frederick Fox and Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Melville McNaughton?
Melville McDougal?
McNaughty? Melville McNaughton? We'll go with that. They surmised that Thomas had been attacked immediately after opening the door, but had still been able to go after the robbers, at which point he had been beaten over the head. They knew that there had been at least 2 assailants, as they had found 2 black stockings with holes cut into them, fashioned as makeshift masks. I didn't think people did this in real life.
Of course they do. Don't be so naive.
Gullible, that's me. Yeah, so the robbers had then gone up the stairs to the flat, attacked Anne, and found the money box. Based on the 2 separate pools of blood, it seemed like Thomas had regained consciousness and confronted them when they came back down, at which point they murdered him. After this, the thieves washed their hands in a nearby basin. That's the only evidence I could understand. Well, no, that's not true. I'm not an idiot. I have a good reading ability.
I've got the reading age of a 5-year-old. I know what I'm doing.
Now, I'm gonna ask you about the fingerprint that they found, because they found a fingerprint inside of the money box.
Oh, good Lord, I wasn't prepared for this. Oh, human involvement. Oh. So, they did find what was described as a greasy smudge on the cash box that appeared to the investigating officers like a fingerprint. So they seized said cashbox and sent it to Scotland Yard. They sent it to Scotland. They didn't send it to Scotland. Scotland Yard's in London. Don't get confused about Scotland and Scotland Yard. It's not Scotland.
Why is it called the Scotland Yard?
Fuck knows why it's called Scotland Yard is in London, nay Scotland. I think that's clarified for all of those immigrants.
They're not gonna get what you're saying without subtitles.
Neither is the jobby who thinks you're South African.
You're what? South African?
Oh, immigrants say what?
That's me. I'm the butt of the joke. Yes, I am. Oh.
So the print that was identified and examined in Scotland Yard was determined to be left by the method of perspiration.
Oh.
Sweaty boys.
I thought the grease was like from something else.
It was thumb grease. Oh, I use that to...
That's not lube.
Oh.
Just for all of you sexually inclined.
Well, that spoiled my next fucking joke.
What was your next joke?
I use that to wank with.
Well, I did spoil that, yeah.
Fucking immigrants ruining my joke. Come over here, take our punchlines. Yeah, so the print was left by perspiration and they identified it as coming from a right thumb. Now, not all fingers are thumbs, but all thumbs are fingers. Get your head around that.
I would assume that your left and right fingerprint, I'm looking at them right now, little thumb and thumbelina. If you're curious about their names. And I would assume that you couldn't tell the difference.
I imagine it was probably down to angles. Maybe there were other hand markings that weren't necessarily recoverable as fingerprints, but you could still determine grip.
Or maybe my thumbs is just a freak every day of the week.
Well, I wouldn't put it past Thumb and Thumbelina, but it's probably more an orientation thing rather than anything else.
And if you're wondering about my orientation, it is...
circular. That's it. That's all that was about the fingerprint on the box.
Oh, okay, cool. So the hope was that Anne would help the police identify the perpetrators, but sadly she never regained consciousness and died because of her injuries 4 days after the attack. The police started interviewing the locals, doing some good old-fashioned police work there, hoping that someone had seen something. And luckily, there were no shortage of eyewitnesses, because at 7 in the morning, people were usually up, and also people knew people in that day and age.
Surprised there weren't any dog walkers.
Well, people were out and about. It was 1905. The sky's the limit. So plenty of people had noticed two men leaving the shop at approximately 7:30 in the morning. One who was dressed in a dark brown suit and cap, and the other was dressed in a dark blue suit and a bowler hat. That's suspicious right there, but it's not in the 1905s.
Well, there's only one 1905.
Yeah, that's true. So, two of the eyewitnesses recognized one of the men, professional boxer Henry John Littlefield, and local girl Ellen Stanton. Told police that the man in the dark brown suit was definitely Alfred Stratton. And how they knew, I don't know. They probably knew people in the general area. That's kind of how the old days was.
Yeah, know your neighbours, accuse them of murder.
True. So Alfred and his brother Albert did not have any criminal convictions, but were known to the police for hanging around in seedy circles. They were also known to extort sex workers for their earnings, and Albert had gotten one of the sex workers he was stealing from and regularly beating, Hannah Cromarty. Don't know how that last name is pronounced, but
Cromarty.
Cromarty. In the, quote, family way, unquote. That's her way of putting it. Yeah.
What?
Pregnante.
Oh,
Pregnante.
got her. Okay, yeah.
So the police brought in Hannah for questioning, and Hannah told them that Albert had indeed been wearing a dark blue suit in the morning of the 27th, and she also told them that he had given the suit away the same day. She was like, fuck this guy.
That was a Monday, right?
Uh-huh, I googled that, bitch. It was a Monday. She said that Albert had asked her for some black stockings,
Suspicious.
if you remember the masks. Yeah. Which she had given him, and that Albert had returned on the 27th, a Monday, with an unexplainably large amount of money. She was like, fuck this dude. Which makes sense because he was a dick. She gave them all the information they wanted and more. So the Stratton brothers were apprehended on the same high street as the shop was located on, and when they charged Alfred, he calmly stated, "Is that all?" Like the cocky buffoon that he was. Because he was.
Is that all you got?
The fingerprint found on the inside of the money box was an exact match for Alfred's thumbprint. Did you have any more on this when we're already on it? How do they do the printing? How do they do the printing? How?
You want the fingerprinty background?
Well, we could do that if you wanted to.
Well, I mean, that's what you just sang about. So, yeah, they lifted the print from the cash box and found that it didn't match either Thomas or Ann Farrow. They also ran it past the database that they had at the time, which compared to modern day was incredibly small.
Oh.
But
There's a but. There's a but, you guys.
there's a but, and it's a big one, which was approximately 80 to 90,000 prints, which, if you think about it, is a very good collection, given that this is the first case tried for murder, and only a couple of years before the first case was passed for petty theft. So they've accumulated a good old amount of fingerprints in a short amount of time. Well done, Scotland Yard. And there was no match. No match to Thomas and Ann, no match to their current database. But thanks to witness testimony, they managed to arrest Alfred and Albert, or if you're not French, Albert. They took their prints, and ding-a-ling-a-ling, there was a positive match. Now we get into fingerprints. Oh, very exciting. Oh, love a bit of fingerprint. Fingerprints are completely unique to every single individual that science knows of. There has not been a recorded case ever since the early 1900s of fingerprints being identical between two individuals, and that includes identical twins. So if you think you're an identical twin, or you are, because it's probably quite easy to tell, and want to go on a crime spree, wear gloves. Fingerprints are mainly identified by a series of ridges, which are raised, and furrows, which are recessed. So if you look at the pads of your fingers, you can see that there are raised ridges.
You can call them by their names, Thumb and Thumbelina.
Yeah, but also your fingers and your toes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the ridges are the high points and the furrows are the bits in between all the ridges. Now, when you are identifying a fingerprint, there are three main points that forensic scientists will look for, and that's the shape of your ridges on your fingerprint. So it can be in the shape of a loop, which is where the ridge will curve back on itself. And there are two different types of ridges. You can either have a radial ridge, where it points towards your radial bone or towards the thumb, and an ulnar ridge, where it points towards your ulnar bone or the little finger. So if you look at your fingerprints, if you've got any loops, they will point one way or the other, left or right, towards your thumb or towards your little finger. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing it? Can you see your loops?
Yeah.
So loops account for approximately 60% of fingerprint patterns. So they're the most common to find on fingerprints. The next thing they look for are whirls. So like a whirlpool, but with an O rather than an I. They're circular or spiral patterns, and this is where nomenclature differs. So the US or the United States of America, yeah, they will define them as being plane, which is concentric circles, a central pocket loop, which is a loop, as previously described, with a circular whirl at the end, a double loop, which looks a bit like an S shape, or an accidental loop. The only description I could find for that was an irregular shape. In the UK, they're called small elliptical, twin, composite, or lateral pocket and accidental loop. So whirls make up about 35% of fingerprint patterns. And then you have arches, which are like a wave pattern, and they're broken down into two subcategories. So you've got plain and you've got tented. And the difference between the two there is that tented arches are a much stronger peak. So it's a sharper point and they look more like a tent rather than a wave. So it's a bit more like an A shape rather than a nice undulating inverted U. And they make up about 5%. So when you combine all three of those patterns, and I'll give you an example, my thumbs are only whirls.
Oh.
So I haven't got loops and I haven't got arches in my thumbs at all. They're just pretty much concentric circles. And apparently, I'm not sure how true this is. So I remember reading somewhere that apparently if you're deprived of oxygen during birth, you're more likely to have circular, whirl-shaped fingerprints.
Oh.
But then also read somewhere else that the fingerprints are formed early in the womb.
Oh.
So, two conflicting evidences, but I was deprived of oxygen during birth. So could be that, could be hocus pocus, hogus bogus, but fun little fact for you.
You're gonna get framed.
They can try, but they wouldn't be able to frame me because they don't have my fingerprints to be able to imprint anywhere.
It's true. So when the brothers were in custody, Albert started getting nervous as evidence against them was mounting. He asked the jailer what he reckoned his chances was, but the jailer didn't want to guess. Albert made sure Alfred wasn't listening and then told the jailer that I reckon he will get strung up and I shall get about 10 years. Like the complete moron that he was. Because that sentence, which could be construed as an admission of guilt, was repeated at the trial when it started on the 5th of May, 1905. McNaughton, Collins, and the Crown prosecutor knew that they faced a difficult trial as the fingerprint was the only real evidence that they had, which I'm guessing was because they couldn't find the murder weapon and stuff and the clothing.
They couldn't find the clothes, but they did a post-mortem of Anne and found that her fatal wounds were consistent with tools that the Stratton brothers had in their possession. But obviously they'd cleaned them and got rid of any external evidence, so it wasn't a direct link so much as a circumstantial link.
Okay. So Colin's teacher, Dr. John Garson, who was into human measuring, anthropometry, which I don't get the point of.
A quick investigation. Like you've said, it's measurements of the human body, but it seems to be more useful in anthropology, forensic anthropology specifically, when they're looking at things like mass graves. So when I was researching this, they said that anthropometry was a direct relative of forensic fingerprinting. I can't see the link between the two. They seem like two distinct disciplines to me.
Yeah. He was more into that as a means of identification rather than fingerprinting, and was set to testify. But it came out that he had been in contact with both prosecution and defense to say that he would testify for whichever side paid him more. Because of this, he was found to not measure up to the standard of what an expert witness should be and was discredited. So the prosecution called over 40 witnesses to the stand, but the jury was distrustful of this new futuristic fingerprinting technique. Detective Inspector Collins was called to the stand as an expert witness instead of his teacher, which is probably good because Garson was not a fan of the fingerprinting technique.
And also Collins is the one that did it.
Did what?
The fingerprint analysis.
Was he?
I think so.
Oh, I didn't know. So he was called to the stand as an expert witness and explained to the court that in all of the 800,000 plus individual digit impressions that the Scotland Yard had on file, he had never come across even one individual's fingerprints to be the same as another's. After a while, this convinced the skeptical jurors, and they sentenced the Stratton brothers to death by hanging. So that's the case. Isn't it crazy that we do have very individual fingerprints? Isn't that like a very strange coincidence?
No, it's just science, man.
Science, bitch. Yeah. What are you gonna do next week? Are you going somewhere?
Going somewhere. No, I booked the week off, actually, because I've got that little to do. But I am going to be busy on Wednesday.
Well, what are you gonna do on Wednesday?
I've got a virtual ticket to watch a recording of QI.
Oh, what? Really?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Your birthday present should be arriving to you next week.
Cool. Nothing has happened since my 30th birthday. Since then, more or less, I've been in lockdown. That's a year. I've sailed through it, obviously, with my mental health intact.
Do you want to read back through some of our conversation history?
Yes. Okay, thank you so much for listening to Midweek Murders. We'll see you next week. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye.